Here we go with Chapter 10, Working Through the Respiratory System. It's important to understand how closely the heart and the lungs work together, and therefore how closely the respiratory system works with the cardiovascular system. And if you have both of them working properly, the body is in good shape. If either one of them has a problem or is sick, then you're going to see the result in the other system as well. Breathing can be divided into two major activities, which are inspiration and expiration. Air is coming into the lungs from the environment and then leaving the body to enter the environment. So here are a list of your objectives for Chapter 10. You have 7 to work through. Should be pretty obvious. And figure 10.1 is just a big overview of the different components of the respiratory system. On top you have the upper respiratory tract, which we'll look at in more detail, and then on the bottom, the lower respiratory tract. So, the pathway that air follows, you need to remember that there is a specific pathway, just like there is a specific pathway for food that we eat. So air is naturally dirty. There's just a lot of garbage in the air. And whether this is just because of dirt particles moving in the air, or if you think about it in terms of the microorganisms, the bacteria, viruses, fungi, when air enters the alveoli at the end of the pathway, down here, it should be clean of any impurities. And it is here that oxygen gets pulled from the air and pushed into the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the lungs to move out of the body during expiration. So the upper respiratory tract is composed of the nose, the pharynx, and the larynx. Air moves through the tract, through the system, and it's going to be filtered. It's going to be warmed, the temperature increased, and it's going to be humidified, meaning it's going to have moisture put into it. Hairs and cilia in the nose act as screening devices, and in the respiratory passages, there's cilia, which beat upward to clean any garbage that might get trapped down as air goes down further into the respiratory tract. The major components of the lower respiratory tract are the trachea, the bronchial tree, and then finally the lungs. All right, within the trachea there are several mechanisms that act to clean the air which we breathe. Here you can find two major components, the cilia, which are these little bristle-like objects or components, and then you have the mucus, which is this blue stuff. The small circles represent dirt of some sort that we breathe, and it begins to move through the upper respiratory tract. Mucus that coats the surface of the respiratory tract is going to act as a magnet, basically, to collect the dirt that we breathe. The cilia then act as an upward escalator, these guys, to move the mucus out of the lungs or out of the respiratory system, and by doing so, moves the dirt back out. All right, usually then, the mucus goes into the throat, and the material is often then naturally swallowed with us not even really thinking about it. So this process cleans the air and keeps garbage out of our lungs. The bronchial tree starts with two main bronchi that lead from the trachea into the lungs. The bronchi continue to branch until they are small bronchioles that are only about 1 millimeter in diameter with very thin walls. This allows a lot of surface area within the lungs for material to move through, right, to pass across the membranes. And the bronchioles eventually lead into elongated sacs called alveoli. All right, the lungs are going to be the secondary bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. The alveoli is really where most of the, if not all of the air exchange is going to occur. The right lung has 3 lobes, while the left lung has 2 lobes. Right? Why is that? Cue the Jeopardy music here. All right, on the left side of your body, you have the heart. And so there needs to be space within the chest cavity for that organ. So therefore, there's a little more room on the right side, 3 lobes there, less room on the left side, 2 lobes there. And then each lobe is divided into lobules. Each lung is going to be enclosed by membranes called the pleura, and this is going to act really as a lubrication mechanism for the lungs against the chest wall that are going to help with inspiration and exhalation. All right, the alveoli. It is important to remember that without surface area within the lungs, right, within the alveoli, you will not get enough air exchange or oxygen and CO2 exchange between the air and the blood. Alveoli are going to be surrounded by capillaries. As you see here, you have the alveoli, which are these little grape-like components, these little sacs, and on the outside you have huge amount of surface area of the capillaries to allow for the air exchange. All right, so it's easy to understand, hopefully, how when you have lung trauma or lung damage, could be from an actual physical injury or from infection, that lungs can fill with blood. Alveoli produce a material called surfactant, which is a lipoprotein that coats the inner surface of the alveoli, and again, really is a lubrication that facilitates expansion during inhalation. So 2 phases of breathing or ventilation. First, you have inspiration, which you have on the left. This is an active process of inhalation that brings air into the lungs, and air moves in due to a negative pressure, and it's caused by muscle contractions that lower the diaphragm and raise the ribs. This expands the thoracic cavity in general, and the lungs follow the wall of the cavity, and thereby sucking air in. On the right, you have expiration. This is typically a passive process that expels air from the lungs. Air moves out, and this is because of increased pressure within the chest cavity. The muscles of the diaphragm and ribs actually relax, and that allows the lungs to be squeezed, basically, to push the air out. The thoracic cavity becomes smaller, lungs become smaller, forcing air out. All right, now looking at air pressure and volume. All right, it's simply the relationship between these two. Gas transport is going to occur through pressure. And during the steps of breathing, you have the exchange of air due to changes in pressure. The external exchange of gases between air and blood occurs in the lungs. The internal exchange of gases occurs between the blood and the tissue fluid. All right, next we can look at how breathing is controlled, and this is going to be through the nervous system. You have a respiratory control center within the brain, specifically the medulla oblongata, that sends out nerve impulses. And these nerve impulses stimulate the muscles to contract within the cell or within the chest cavity. And then that process really just flows naturally. After that nerve impulse, the chest cavity expands, you have air come in, it releases or relaxes, and air is released back into the environment. When there's a problem within the brain, there can be a very quick change in the breathing pattern. And a lot of times, if there is a brain injury, physicians are going to look for changes within the respiratory, the breathing pattern, to try to determine where the injury is within the brain. All right, sudden infant death syndrome is thought to occur when the center of the brain, the medulla oblongata, stops sending out nerve signals and the infant simply stops breathing. All right, the exchange of gas in the body is actually very quick. It takes a quarter of a second for oxygen to exchange from the air to the blood. When blood enters the lungs, it gives up carbon dioxide and picks up oxygen very quickly. And if you remember from chapter 3, that diffusion is the exchange of molecules across the membrane, moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. And this is what's occurring between both oxygen and carbon dioxide. All right, here is a video that you may or may not be able to play, and it's just looking at the pathway of blood moving through in terms of where the oxygen is. So this is just a figure that represents that, and it's a good figure to look at for two reasons. First is that it shows a pathway of blood circulating through the body and the levels of oxygen it has in it. The red blood represents high levels of oxygen, while the blue represents levels of low oxygen. The oxygen gets pulled out of the blood within the capillaries that you see down here, and the figure shows both external and internal respiration. External is the big picture of respiration and the mechanisms of breathing, while internal respiration shows the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide between both the blood and the air. All right, here's another video that probably won't work in your PowerPoint file, but I believe, yes, these are in Canvas. You have 3 short videos. One is just 90 seconds, and then a couple of them are between 2 minutes and maybe 4 minutes in length. But they're very good videos to watch, and it's easy to watch them a couple of times just to get the idea straight in your head. All right, so internal respiration, you can look at it from the angle of chemistry. All right, you've got a fair amount of notes below this slide that you can look at, and I'm not going to read it all just for the sake of time, but here you have hemoglobin, the hemoglobin is going to give up or take on oxygen to give you oxyhemoglobin. All right, and oxygen can break off, and that allows it to move to the tissue. And then most carbon dioxide is going to be carried as bicarbonate. So you have carbon or carbon dioxide plus water and an enzyme that's going to hook them together. And so that is how carbon dioxide is carried throughout the blood. And then it can be released to give a hydrogen, which is going to result in actually acid. And then carbonic acid here, or bicarbonate. This is carbonic acid. So this is acid, and then this is going to be the base, and that is how CO2 is transported. But this is very important in terms of trying to understand and think about homeostasis. And why is it important to be able to breathe properly? In order to have homeostasis within the body.